But even on the Microsoft side, we now have another option, which is Bicep. And we'll talk a bit about what are the differences between the Bicep and the Terraform world in a bit. Then we also have Terraform, but there's also other options like Pulumi, etc. But these kind of basic principles that we start with, they are common to all of these different tools. So what is kind of the main thing that is common to all of these is that these are declarative. All we need to do is give the final settings that we want our resource to have in that configuration file. We don't have to tell it in what order to create the resources. So it kind of makes our job easy. We just state we would like our resource in this particular state, and then the tooling does the rest for us. So it makes it quite a bit easy. And if we compare this to scripting, when we have this definition of infrastructure as code being declarative, it kind of takes things like PowerShell and Azure CLI out of the picture, because there you actually need to specify in which order you do things. We're not just telling the end state. The other quality here that we need to have is idempotency. So what that means is that we can run the same configuration again and again, and always end up with the same end result. With scripting, for example, we need to consider the scenarios where the resources already exist and handle that in some way. And we kind of have to build all that handling into our scripts that we have available. So why would we go with infrastructure as code? It's kind of faster going into the Azure portal and just clicking your resources up and getting your environment up and running if you do it once. So why would we choose this way? It takes a little more time. One aspect is that we get a bit of documentation by doing this way. We have these simple configuration files where you can see all the settings of your resources. You don't have to go into the portal to check, well, what was the specific setting for this resource? But I'm a big fan of pictures, as you might be able to tell. In my opinion, you do need these high-level pictures still, even if you have this infrastructure as code documentation. Wow. It got dark. All right. So you will still need those high-level pictures available for you to make sense of how the different bits and pieces of your configuration files fit together. The other benefit here is repeatability. So what that really means is that you are able to either create identical environments whenever you need. For example, if you have an issue in your environment, you could set up an identical environment with just a few configuration changes and setting a different variable, and have it up and running very, very fast when you have it done it in this way. If you had done it manually, you'd have to go in and figure out what were the settings and what was clicked in what phase, and figure that out from the portal. So this really eases that a scenario where you need to get the environment up quickly. Thirdly, what this enables us to do, since these are just files, they are configuration files, it means that we're able to use version control. And when we're able to use version control, what that brings to us is, for example, that if we end up in a situation where we have an error in our environment, we're able to roll that back and go back to the previous state easily by just going to the previous version of the configuration files. Those are just some of the main benefits. And today you will also see how easy it is to get started. It doesn't take that much effort. It is a bit scary if you haven't done it before, but it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to get started. So to make sense of this all a little bit more, we're going to take a bit of a look under the hood in Azure. And you've all heard about Azure Resource Manager. But what actually happens behind the scenes is that we have these resource providers available. And what that means is that for every resource type in Azure, there is their own resource provider. And each of these are actually showing an API that defines what kind of things you can do with this resource. So those will define, for example, what kind of settings you can set for these resources, how you can scale them, how you can configure them, can you set auto-scaling, you name it, whatever kind of thing we can do for that resource. And that is actually defined at the resource provider level. And so when we communicate with Azure, we are talking through this Azure Resource Manager REST API. And even when working with the portal, it then gets routed to these different resource providers behind the scenes. And then there is also some SDKs, so software development kits, available that are able to talk with this REST API as well. So that means that we have ways to talk to this REST API with different software languages. And this is what makes all this possible, that we have these resource providers that are defined through APIs. It makes it possible that we are even able to define these resources in this configuration file style that we are going to be looking at. And you can even see this in the Azure portal. When you go into your resource group and do export template, you can see the ARM template format of that. But it kind of shows how the configuration is structured on the Azure side as well. All right, that's it. We have some background now about what is infrastructure as code. And we're then next going to be hopping into Terraform specifically and how to get started. What do you need? So if we think about this whole scenario of how Azure is built and all that, how Terraform actually communicates with this is through the SDKs. And so to be able to work with Terraform, we're going to need, well, our laptop in this case. And on our laptop, we're going to need Azure CLI. But then, in addition to that, what we're going to be needing is Terraform installed as well. But after that, we're able to get started with our first Terraform file. It is a file with a TF ending. And then when we make the deployment to Azure, this will talk through the Go SDK specifically. So Terraform is communicating with Azure with the Go SDK in this case. So that's all you need. Just Azure CLI and Terraform. Terraform specifically is super light to download. It's not much setup at all. You just download it and set it on your path, and you get going. That's it. So then after you have these in place, then when you do your first deployment, how Terraform tracks the changes that you make to Azure is by using this state file. And the state file tracks the state of your resources. What are the settings that you have configured for them? And it compares always when you're making changes, those changes against the state file, and sees what kind of changes it would be making when you do those. And you'll see that in practice in just a moment. So the question still stands now that we're talking about Terraform specifically. Why would we use Terraform? Well, the first point is that it is actually really easy syntax that we have to use. So the learning curve is super it's not difficult. You'll see in a moment. This is, of course, true for other languages as well. So it's not necessarily a Terraform-specific pro, but it is definitely easier syntax than, for example, in ARM templates. The other benefit that really is different from ARM templates and Bicep is that Terraform supports many providers. And what that means that with Terraform, we can work with Azure, but we could work with AWS or GCP, and we can work with Azure AD. The one thing to note is that with ARM templates and Biceps, we cannot, for example, work with Azure AD, because Azure AD is not an Azure resource that gets set into your Azure subscription. So we don't work through those resource providers when we're working with Azure AD. So that's why Bicep and ARM templates don't support it. But with Terraform, that is possible as well. And lastly, the one benefit here is also that Terraform gets updated really frequently, and they do a lot of collaboration with Microsoft. So there's about every 6 days, there's a new version of the Azure provider in Terraform available. And so new features come in quite quickly. There are, of course, always some exceptions to that when there is some kind of bug or something going on that is blocking a new feature coming into Terraform. But it is updating really frequently, and those new capabilities are coming in. The one thing to note is that because Terraform uses the Go SDK, it means that any preview features are not available, because those preview features are not yet in the Go SDK. So when you are wanting to use some preview features in Azure, you do need to then combine a bit of Azure CLI, for example, in there, to get going, or even ARM templates. There's many ways that we can work around that. But that's just good to know and kind of keep in mind. So with that, we are able to get started with our first Terraform deployment. And what we're going to be starting with is that we're going to be creating a resource group. And then we're going to be creating some Azure Data Platform resources in there. We're going to create an Azure Data Lake, a Data Factory, and then an Azure SQL as well. But you will, through this example, you will see kind of how you can work with any resource going forward. So we're going to get started. And first, we're going to be setting the provider here. So I have my Visual Studio Code open already. I myself have Terraform installed and Azure CLI as well. So when we start to do the deployments, the one thing that you need to keep in mind is that you need to do AZ login first. So log into whatever subscription you want those changes to go into that you are creating with Terraform. So I have already done that. So we're just able to get started with our first file. So I don't actually want that in there. Sorry. There we go. So I'm just going to create a main TF file here. And that is what we're going to be starting with. So kind of the simplest way to get started with Terraform and the Azure side of things is to actually go into the Terraform documentation. And when we go to the Azure provider side, you find this use provider link at the top right. And you actually find this snippet that you can just copy-paste over into your code. And so this has specified the latest Azure provider version in here. And the one thing to note here is that we are going to need a empty features flag at the least in here. In there, you can specify other things about how you work with your Azure resources. But in the main scenario, you can just leave it empty for now. All right. That's our provider set. And the first thing that we need to run with Terraform is to run Terraform init. And what that does is it actually pulls any providers that you have defined here and downloads them onto your working machine that you might be working with. So you can notice that this .terraform folder appeared in here. And actually here you can find the Azure RM provider there. All right, we have the provider set. And that means that we are able to create our first resource. And since I'm using VS Code and I have the Terraform extension, it gives me quite a bit of help about it. So let's start with that. I'm just gonna, there we go. So I want to grab the resource group here. And then the name here means actually the name within Terraform itself, so that we can then reference this resource in our other resources. So for example, if we then want to create a resource within this resource group, we just specify it here. So what we need is, of course, a name. I'm just going to specify this. And then we're going to need a location. All right. That's all that we are going to need for our resource group. So that means that we're actually now able to run Terraform itself. So what we are going to do first is that we're going to be running Terraform plan. And what the plan command does is it actually looks at the configuration that you have made and checks what kind of changes would this make in your Azure environment. Would it actually create some resources, delete some? What would happen? So that will take a moment, and it will just compare these resources to what I have in Azure. So if I just expand that a bit, it just shows, OK, there will be a resource group created. And if that looks good to me, then I can just run Terraform apply. So there is 3 main commands you need to remember and use One is the init, which you run when you are setting up your providers, and any time that you are adding any new providers or upgrading to a newer version of the provider. Then after that, when you are actually defining the resources themselves, then you have the plan step, where you can see what kind of changes it would make. And third, then we have the apply, which is then making the changes. As you can see, even in the apply, it shows me actually the plan as well. So when you get familiar with everything, you can kind of just run the apply, and then you have still a moment here to bail. But if it all looks good, you can just type yes, and it's good to go. So that will then take those resources that it saw here, the resource group, and then going to create that in Azure for us. So it says that is created. We can go into the Azure portal. The thing here is to note is that actually the visual interface sometimes takes a moment to catch up to the programmatic side. And I hope I have the correct subscription open, actually. Oops. Let's just double check. It doesn't help to have the same name. There it is. We have our resource group. But since we didn't actually define any resources, it means that there's no resources in here yet. But the resource group is there. All right. That's the first deployment for us. We have set the provider. We have created the first resource, even if it's a resource group. And now we're going to just look at more samples of creating other resources and then look into how to use variables as well. All right. So I have done some prep beforehand so that you don't have to watch me typing all the time. So I'm just going to grab that file and just move it over. And with Terraform, you can have the definition of your different resources divided into different files in the same folder. So it always takes all the files that are in that one folder that you're working in. So for example, even though I have here split some resources into this data file, it doesn't matter. Terraform will just pick all of those up. So we are going to be using the same structure here as we have been using with the resource group. We specify the resource. We specify the Azure resource type. So for example, the storage account. We give it a name that we want to use to reference here in our Terraform. And then we just specify the different settings that we want to be there. So for example, here I have specified the is HNS enabled. And that is the hierarchical namespace within Azure Storage. And that, of course, makes it a data lake for us to use. And really, at this point, when you're putting these different settings in, what becomes your best pal at this phase is the documentation. So whatever resource you want to create, you can just go to it in the documentation, for example, here, storage. And we're creating an Azure storage account. Sorry, let's get that out of the way. And then you can find kind of example usage about it, and sometimes even several ones. And the main point is that you can find all these definitions of the different variables that you can set in here as well. So that's kind of, in the beginning, it is a lot of going back and forth between the documentation and then going back to working with your files. So I have put in several few points here. We have the Azure SQL and the SQL database. And it kind of comes from that you need to know what kind of settings you need to specify. So for example, for the SQL server, you need to give the administrator login and then the administrator login password. So those are the things that are required. And then creating the database within there, we need to reference actually the SQL server that we just created before there. So we are able to here also reference other resources that we would like to use. And then we just take the resource type here, then we specify the name that we gave it here, so this one. And then we specify what what setting there do we want to reference. So in this case, it's the server ID, so we give it the ID setting there. So that is the main functionality here. And as you can see that, for example, because most resources require the resource group, we also have the reference to the resource group name using that direct reference to the resource in Terraform. And what that enables us, we could always, of course, just type the resource group name here as well. But what this reference through the .rg.name does is that it enables that that resource group is fully created before it starts to create all these other resources. So that makes our life a whole lot easier. And as you might see, at some point it becomes kind of obvious that we would start, for example, repeating similar structures in our naming of our resources. Here, when we started in the resource group, I just wrote out these things. But what we would probably want to do is to separate those into variables. So I'm just going to create a variable TF file. And within here, I'm just going to create a new variable and give that a name. I'm going to call it envname. And then I am able to just, I could give it a type. So this is going to be a string. And then I am able to give it a default value as well. So as I was using this space over here, I am just going to put that as my default value here. So that's going to be my envname. And now if I want to actually be using that variable instead of typing it everywhere, I am just going to do this string interpolation here and just reference it with this. So var.envname, that is how we can reference it. So that will just take whatever value we put in here into the variables and then put that into all our resources. And so now you start to see that it would become very easy to just create different environments by just changing this one environment name. And of course, any resource kind of settings that you have that you want to be environment specific, you can have those in the variables sections so that you can specify those as you are actually running the Terraform apply. All right. So we have replaced that. And actually here, we already have this var envname reference over here. And with Terraform, you're also able to do some manipulation and kind of expressions and functions that you're able to use. And so, for example, for storage accounts, we're not able to use the dash. So we're able to use this replace function, give it the envname that is defined in our variables, and then just replace the dash with essentially nothing, so taking it out. And then we can just interpolate that all into our string and get that storage account name. All right. I am just going to do a little tweak here. Yes. I'm just going to give this password here. Oh, thank you, lovely. It's just going to be something for the first part, and then we're going to check how would we actually handle these secrets. So I'm just going to be brave and run immediately Terraform apply. It will show me if I have any errors. It will show me the plan phase as well. So I always have the chance to abort if something goes wrong. So I can kind of verify that everything, all the changes that I'm creating here look OK. This time we can see there's quite much more in here. There is, for example, this is the storage account. And the one nice thing I like about working with Terraform is that you kind of are forced to look behind the scenes at all the settings that are available. As you can see, like there's many here that we never even think about when working in the portal. So it's like pointing you to those settings and like it's all there. You just never pay attention. So it can look a little much in the beginning, but it's kind of nice and gives you a peek behind the scenes. And we have the SQL server, and then we have the database as well. So all looks good. We're just going to say yes. And we're going to actually leave that running. We're not going to wait for it. And we're just going to get on to the next bit and then check on that in a little bit. All right. So we now know how to use variables. So for variables, put in any settings or strings that you're going to be repeating in many places. So for example, naming convention, bits that you want to use across all resources. And then also put in any settings that you want to be environment specific, so that you don't want to actually hard code in your Terraform files. Put those into the variables as well. And then we kind of come to this point that I kind of just pushed to the side a moment ago. So we need to figure out how to handle secrets. That is one important thing, especially when working with the Azure SQL, for example. We need to give an admin password when we create that. So that is where we're going to get to. And I actually, oh no! I am shocked. This didn't happen before. Oh no. All right. I have heard that others have been having this issue recently as well. So I am not allowed to create something in West Europe. I'm not sure. I'm gonna try to change that, change the location there. But I do not have guarantees that it will work, because there has been some issues recently. It has not hit me before, even when I was testing this, but of course. I should probably go with something other than Europe. What do you think? What's the official name of Sweden? All right. Luckily, I have somebody who can check that. I'm just going to keep that at North Europe for now. We'll see. We'll anyways talk about the secrets, no matter what the situation is there. So one thing that we need to handle is these secrets. So as you see, I put in a massive string here. But of course, when this is a configuration file, we really don't want our admin password to be there in plain text. So I'm just actually going to go back a bit, leave that there, and let's get the location fixed in a bit. We will need to work in other ways to have that value passed in there. And what I have done in this example is that I have created a module. So what a module does, I have this key vault module in here. What this module does is that it defines a set of resources into its own folder, so that you can then call this module from another file and just pass some variables in there, and then the module will take care of what kind of resources to create. So for example, in this case, it is creating, if we look into this module and look at the main file, it is creating an Azure Key Vault resource, like this. And it is also, from this module, it is also outputting a Key Vault ID and Key Vault URI. So what is the benefit of using these modules is whenever you have, for example, organizational best practices that you want your Key Vault always to be created with specific settings, then you could have all those settings wrapped into this module, and you could just direct your users to call this module itself. And that way you can ensure that they are using these settings that you have specified and the configuration that you want them to use. And of course, it also speeds up the process for others, because then everyone who's using the Key Vault doesn't need to be using it the same way. You know, they don't have to write the entire full file. So in most kind of everyday scenarios, these modules do grow much bigger. So this one is just a small sample where we just have this Key Vault resource. We still do the resource definitions the same way as we would do in the main file that we were working with in the beginning. But this is now something that we are able to call from another place. So if we then take a look at how to call this module. I have prepared this key vault file. And so how we call this module is that we, instead of using a resource block, we use a module block. And again, we give it a name. This doesn't have to be the same as the module name. It's just a name for you to reference again in your Terraform files. And then you give it from where can this module be found. So this is now pointing to this path that I have here, the modules, key vault, etc. And I actually think this might be wrong, but we will see in a moment. And then again, since I am again in this folder where I have my variables, etc., I am able to use that env name variable that I said before, grab the resource group name, grab the resource group location. And then something that I'm going to do is I'm going to give some permissions to Azure Key Vault. Because by default, when we create an Azure Key Vault, it doesn't get any rights by default. So we have to actually specify those. And what you could actually see if we look at these modules here, the Key Vault module, is that I enabled RBAC for this. So how I'm able to then give those rights from where I'm calling this is by creating an Azure role assignment, so creating an RBAC role in this Terraform. And I'm going to use this Key Vault module. So I'm referencing the module, this, and the name Key Vault, and then the Key Vault ID there. Sweet and central. We're going to try that. And one neat thing that I did here is that I used this kind of data Azure RM client config resource, which grabs the user that I'm running these with. So this is just a neat thing to know that you can leverage that. And while I still remember, I am going to write this sweet and central here for our SQL server. And I've never had to write sweet and central yet. So let's see what happens. Yes. All right. So I'm calling my module that creates my Key Vault. I'm giving myself the Key Vault administrator role. But even when we do that, we don't actually yet have anything to put into the Key Vault. There's nothing in the Key Vault. So one option would be to create the Key Vault and then manually put the value in there that we want to use. But what I did for this purpose is that we're going to generate a random password. And this is where the Terraform different many providers aspect becomes very useful, is that we have all these neat providers that do different kinds of things. This provider, for example, creates different random strings and passwords, etc. And it has a resource called random password. And you give it a length, and you give it like how many minimum of lowercase letters and uppercase letters and numeric values do you want there. And then it just generates it for you, and you don't have to print it anywhere. It will be stored in the state file that Terraform uses to keep track of the resources, but it won't be visible anywhere. And then, as the last step, I am passing that random password into that Key Vault. So I'm creating an Azure RM Key Vault secret, and I'm giving it a name, and then I'm setting that value in there. So that's how we get going. And let me just double check here. We will see if everything falls apart. One thing we are going to need, since we are using a new kind of resource provider, if you can remember, we had this resource required providers block in the very beginning. I'm going to need to also put this random provider in here and specify that I want to use it and where it can be found. So we at least have to specify the source. And it's just HashiCorp and random. So you would find this in the Terraform documentation as well. And if we don't go ahead and specify a version, it will just get the latest one. So if we want to always stick with the latest, you can leave that out. All right. We will see how it goes. All right, and it now tells me that we need to run the Terraform in it, as I did tell you in the beginning. Now I know what's wrong. I was looking at this path here, that it looks a bit off in this case. I think that should do it. So always read the errors. That's always a good tip when working with any kind of coding. Read what the error is telling you, and you will easily find what is wrong. So it was just the wrong path. And now we're able to run the apply. And you can kind of see things happening here when I'm running the apply. It's, for example, you can see the state file over here, and then you can see also backup of the state file that it creates at this case, at this point when it's doing the apply, when it's doing like the checking of what do you want to create and what is there already. So now it shows that there's 6 to add. There's the key vault. There's the random password. So that is also a resource from the Terraform perspective. There's the role assignment and so forth. There's the Azure SQL Server as well. We'll just let that run and see if we have any better luck with the SQL at this point. But if not, we will have the other resources to check at in a moment. All right, we will leave this here. You can see that you can kind of follow the progress. It shows you how far along it's with creating each of those resources. It has created the SQL password, but it's now getting into creating the key vault and so forth. And lastly, when we're working with Terraform deployment, we have one more command that we can use, which is Terraform destroy. And yes, it sounds a bit extreme, and it is. So that is what you can then, I could run in that same folder, and it would delete all those resources. I'm not sure we now have time to look at it in practice, but note this, that when you are working with data, necessarily once you have data within those databases and your data lake, you don't necessarily want to run destroy that much anymore. You need to have your data somewhere where to get it when you redeploy your environment. But especially when starting to work with Terraform, it's good to just wipe the slate clean and run Terraform destroy, and then verify that everything comes up from scratch again when you run Terraform apply. So that's the last tip. All right, we have seen how to get started with Terraform. As you can see, it doesn't take a whole lot to get your first resource up. That came quite fast. But it does get then a bit complex when you get into modules and creating that structure to support you. But the basic idea is always the same. You specify what resource you want to create, you give it a name, and you create set the different configurations that you need for that resource. That basic principle is always there. So lastly, well, let's see. It is still creating. So lastly, we're going to take a quick look at how this changes the way you work. So we're going to look at how then you would work with these files. So you've been totally happy working on your files on your own laptop, creating your Terraform files and creating your resources in Azure. And what's most likely going to happen is other people are going to notice it and notice that you're maybe a bit less stressed about changes, and you are able to make new deployments fast, and they're kind of starting to wonder like, I want to get in on what they're doing. So how we then start to work in this way, that we start to work with other people on this, is that, well, firstly, as you saw, we were working there. The state file was on my computer. So we need to get that state file to, for example, Azure. We can have it in Azure storage. That's the first step. But the other thing that we need to do is that we need to have some kind of version control. So we would preferably have something like Git on our local computer to track the changes that we make locally on those files. But on the other hand, what we're also going to need when we work with other people is some kind of central repository, like GitHub or GitLab or Azure DevOps or whatever that central repo is, so that all of you can work on those same files. We don't anymore, we can't just go into the portal and get the files from there in one way. So we need some kind of central repository for the files. So how you then work with this is, it depends a bit on where you start with, but if you have all the files and you want to get started, you first run git init, and that's how you get Git to track your files and track those changes that you are making to your files locally. And then we add a remote address that we want to use. So that's what links your local Git with that central repository that can be elsewhere. The other option would be, of course, that all those files are already in the central repo, and you just want to pull them for yourself, so that's when you would use the git clone command. But let's say you now have your files and you're connected to that central repo, and you want to start working on the new files. So what you would do first is you would create a branch for yourself, and then you would choose that I actually want to use this branch. So just running git branch won't check out that branch. And what the branch really does is it takes whatever is in the Git repo at that point, and it creates your own copy for you and starts to track those changes in that separate branch. So then when you make your new Terraform file, you then add that to Git, and you give it some very descriptive commit. Then your branch keeps moving and keeps adding those different changes, but the main branch is still in the previous state that it was in. And then once you're ready with all your changes, you would create a pull request, and then it's possible for other people to review that, make comments, and check that everything works. And then you're able to push those changes to that central repo and get everything in order. So you see that the way you work with these files becomes quite a bit different. You need to get familiar with Git and almost like software development processes and pull requests and so forth. And so this last part was just to give you a little bit of a taste of what that process would look like. And it will take just a little bit of practice to get the hang of it. And that's the best way to go. So we've looked at the introduction of what are the basic principles for infrastructure as code. We looked at how to get started with Terraform. And then lastly, we looked at how the workflow then changes when you work in that way. And before I say the closing words, we can see that our database is creating, yay. So the change of location actually seemed to help. And if we go into Azure portal, we can see all those resources are created there. As you can see, I had a little mishap with the key vault naming. It's not as pretty, but it's all showing up here. And now it means that it would be really easy for me to just pass a different env name and create an identical environment in that sense. But as you can see, the limits of this go to the infrastructure layer. This is infrastructure as code, so this is for deploying your infrastructure and automating that side. So that's it for today. I really hope you enjoyed it. I want to remind you to give feedback. You have a chance to win some prizes when you give feedback, plus for every 10 feedbacks that we get, we are also then, or SQLBits is then planting a tree as well, so that's neat as well. And I want to keep making this session better, so please leave me some feedback. What could I make better? How could I make this better for you? All right. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you learned something new today. We have 1 minute for questions. Do we have any?
There's no questions online.
All right. Perfect.
We have 10 people online.
All right. Does anyone here have questions?
We need to clear the resource.
Mm.
Is that free text, or does that have to be exactly something that matches in Azure?
No, this can be whatever name you want to give it. So it could be, I could do it, for example, KV admin. I oftentimes make these a little shorter, you know, just a name that I can remember and reference elsewhere if I need it. Yeah, exactly. Good question. All right, and if you do have any questions, you know, you can always come up to me here and just chat. I'm always open for that, so have a fun rest of the day.